201 in my edition, 243 in yours. Paragraph starts, he was starting up from the plank bed in the half-certainty that he heard O'Brien's voice. You remember he and Julia have been captured. They know all about everything that's been going on. And now the famous torture, the infamous even, torture scene. But O'Brien, he's always had this strange relationship. He thought that O'Brien was on his side. He was starting up from the plank bed in the half-certainty that he had heard O'Brien's voice. All through his interrogation, though he had never seen him, he had had the feeling that O'Brien was at his elbow, just out of sight. It was O'Brien who was directing everything. It was he who set the guards onto Winston and who prevented them from killing him. It was he, O'Brien, who decided when Winston should scream with pain, when he should have a respite, when he should be fed, when he should sleep, when the drugs should be pumped into his arm. It was he who asked the questions and suggested the answers. He was the tormentor. He was the protector. He was the inquisitor. He was the friend. People have commented that later they identified this as Stockholm Syndrome, after Stockholm, Sweden, that people in this situation start looking at the person torturing them as a sort of a father figure, a friend. Too complicated for us to spend time on today. And once, Winston could not remember whether it was in drugged sleep or in normal sleep, or even in a moment of wakefulness, a voice murmured in his ear, "Don't worry, Winston, you are in my keeping. For 7 years I have watched over you. Now the turning point has come. I shall save you. I shall make you perfect." I read him with some indications of the way Orwell says to read him, as a school teacher, a schoolmaster, a British schoolmaster, and maybe with slight overtones of Churchillian accent. He was not sure whether it was O'Brien's voice, but it was the same voice that had said to him, "We shall meet in the place where there is no darkness," in that other dream 7 years ago. And now it opens up with the climax of the tortures. He did not remember any ending to his interrogation. There was a period of blackness, and then the cell, or room, in which he now was, had gradually materialized around him. He was almost flat on his back and unable to move. His body was held down at every essential point. Even the back of his head was gripped in some manner. O'Brien was looking down at him gravely and rather sadly. His face, seen from below, looked coarse and worn, with pouches under the eyes and tired lines from nose to chin. He was older than Winston had thought him. He was perhaps 48 or 50. Under his hand there was a dial with a lever on top and figures running around the face of the dial. "I told you," said O'Brien, "that if we met again, it would be here." "Yes," said Winston. Without any warning except a slight movement of O'Brien's hand, a wave of pain flooded his body. It was a frightening pain, because he could not see what was happening, and he had the feeling that some mortal injury was being done to him. He did not know whether the thing was really happening or whether the effect was electrically produced, but his body was being wrenched out of shape. The joints were being slowly torn apart. although the pain had brought the sweat out on his forehead. The worst of all was the fear that his backbone was about to snap. He set his teeth and breathed hard through his nose, trying to keep silent as long as possible. "You are afraid," said O'Brien, watching his face, "that in another moment something is going to break. Your especial fear is that it will be your backbone. You have a vivid mental picture of the vertebrae snapping apart and the spinal fluid dripping out of them. That is what you are thinking, is it not, Winston?" Winston did not answer. O'Brien drew back the lever on the dial. The wave of pain receded almost as quickly as it had come. "That was 40, said O'Brien. "You can see that the numbers on this dial run up to 100. Will you please remember, throughout our conversation, that I have it in my power to inflict pain on you at any moment and to whatever degree I choose. If you tell me any lies, or attempt to prevaricate in any way, or even fall below your usual level of intelligence, you will cry out with pain instantly. Do you understand that?" What was that sound? It sounded like music or something. Maybe must be metal falling outside. Heavy metal. "You will cry out with pain instantly. Do you understand that?" "Yes," said Winston. O'Brien's manner became less severe. He resettled his spectacles thoughtfully and took a pace or two up and down. When he spoke, his voice was gentle and patient. He had the air of a doctor, a teacher, even a priest, anxious to explain and persuade rather than to punish. And in this way, Orwell relates him to what a doctor, a medieval doctor, or a teacher or a priest actually does. Put you through this. Those are the people who, in woke times we understand. It isn't I thought it strange, gee, he's the bad guy. Why should he be compared to a teacher? Well, there are teachers and then there are other kinds of teachers. The way he talks to Winston is like a priest putting someone through the torture of the Inquisition to save their soul. This is not unheard of in human life. And of course his major models came from Soviet Russia. "I am taking trouble with you, Winston." No, I don't use Churchill's accent, but his ponderous manner and the slight speech disability, yes. "I am taking trouble with you, Winston," he said, "because you are worth trouble. You know perfectly well what is the matter with you. You have known it for years, though you have fought against the knowledge. You are mentally deranged. You suffer from a defective memory." And then he says, "But it's curable, and he's going to cure it." And O'Brien refers to the event that we saw happen at the very beginning of the book. If you'll scan down to the paragraph that starts "Another example." He describes what happens, which sets Winston on his road to find out some truth that is independent of the party, something that was just real. 2 + 2 makes 4. And he wrote that. Freedom is the ability to say the obvious. 2 and 2 makes 4. not 5. Another example, he said, O'Brien. Some years ago you had a very serious delusion indeed. You believed that 3 men, 3 one-time party members named Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, men who were executed for treachery and sabotage, after making the fullest possible confessions, were not guilty of the crimes they were charged with. And he says that you even found a certain photograph and you had a hallucination. You believed you held this photograph in your hands. It was a photograph something like this. An oblong slip of newspaper had appeared. Now, what this photograph had proved was that on the date when they supposedly did the sabotage and treachery, here was a photograph from an early edition of the newspaper, earlier edition, showing them on a different continent, incapable of having done it. It was evidence that the party did lie. And Winston immediately threw it down the memory hole. That's his job, you remember. Changing George Washington from being the beloved president, I mean, if he was an American, into a person who owned slaves or whatever, constantly rewriting the past, and anything which doesn't fit with what the party says this week, you throw away and you burn. Someone remarked in a podcast about 2 days ago that there was a reference to the man who was assaulting women in the subway as, they didn't call him homeless, they said he was an unhoused person. And suddenly all the woke people used that. It was no longer politically correct to say homeless. It called up too many images of people in tents taking drugs, I suppose. Now they were unhoused. So he would go through the newspapers and throw out or patch up anybody who had ever said homeless, and now it's unhoused. That's what Winston throws down the memory hole in the beginning. And the incriminating photograph appears between O'Brien's fingers. For perhaps 5 seconds it was within the angle of Winston's vision. It was a photograph, and there was no question of its identity. It was the photograph. It was another copy of the photograph of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford at the party function in New York, which he had chanced upon 11 years ago and promptly destroyed. For only an instant it was before his eyes, then it was out of sight again. But he had seen it, unquestionably, he had seen it. He made a desperate, agonizing effort to wrench the top half of his body free. It was impossible to move so much as a centimeter in any direction. For the moment he had even forgotten the dial. All he wanted was to hold the photograph in his fingers again, or at least to see it. "It exists!" he cried. "No," said O'Brien. He stepped across the room. There was a memory hole in the opposite wall. O'Brien lifted the grating. Unseen, the frail slip of paper was whirling away on the current of warm air. It was vanishing in a flash of flame. O'Brien turned away from the wall. "Ashes," he said. "Not even identifiable ashes. Dust. It does not exist. It never existed." And now we get to the debate. Let me have a sip for a second. Do you have a question or a comment at this point, Ray? Any thought?
Attempts to just deny everything he knows is true. Very jarring sort of experience.
But here it comes. But it did exist. It does exist. It exists in memory. I remember it. You remember it. "I do not remember it," said O'Brien. Winston's heart sank. That was doublethink. It's another important term. He had a feeling of deadly helplessness. If he could have been certain that O'Brien was lying, it would not have seemed to matter, but it was perfectly possible that O'Brien had really forgotten the photograph. He's looking down at him speculatively. More than ever, O'Brien had the air of a teacher, taking pains with a wayward but promising child. There is a party slogan dealing with the control of the past. Repeat it, if you please. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past, repeated Winston obediently. Who controls the present controls the past, said O'Brien, nodding his head with slow approval. Is it your opinion, Winston, that the past has real existence? Again the feeling of helplessness descended upon Winston. His eyes flitted toward the dial. He not only did not know whether yes or no was the answer that would save him from pain, he did not even know which answer he believed to be the true one. O'Brien smiled faintly. You are no metaphysician, Winston, he said. Until this moment, you had never considered what is meant by existence. I will put it more precisely. Does the past exist concretely, in space? Is there somewhere or other a place, a world of solid objects, where the past is still happening? No. Then where does the past exist, if at all? In records. It is written down in records. And in the mind, in human memories. In memory. Very well then. We, the party, control all records, and we control all memories. Then we control the past, do we not? But how can you stop people remembering things? Cried Winston, again momentarily forgetting the dial. It is involuntary. It's outside oneself. How can you control memory? You have not controlled mine. O'Brien's manner grew stern again. He laid his hand on the dial. On the contrary, you have not controlled it. That is what has brought you here. You are here because you have failed in humility, in self-discipline. You would not make the act of submission, which is the price of sanity. You prefer to be a lunatic, a minority of one. Only the disciplined mind can see reality, Winston. You believe that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. You also believe that the nature of reality is self-evident. When you delude yourself into thinking that you see something, you assume that everyone else sees the same thing as you. But I tell you, Winston, reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. And he says that whatever the party holds to be, the party is the sum total of all human minds, and whatever the party holds to be truth is truth. You have to look at it through the eyes of humanity, of the party. You need an act of self-destruction. You must humble yourself before you can become sane. He paused for a few moments, as though to allow what he had been saying to sink in. Do you remember, he said, writing in your diary, freedom is the freedom to say that 2 plus 2 make 4. Yes, said Winston. O'Brien held up his left hand, its back towards Winston, with the thumb hidden and the forefingers extended. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? 4. And if the party says it is not 4, but 5, then how many? 4. The word ended in a gasp of pain. The needle of the dial had shot up to 55. The sweat had sprung out all over Winston's body. The air tore into his lungs and issued again in deep groans, which even by clenching his teeth he could not stop. O'Brien watched him, the forefingers still extended. He drew back the lever. This time the pain was only slightly eased. How many fingers, Winston? 4. The needle went up to 60. How many fingers, Winston? 4. What else can I say? 4. The needle must have risen again, but he did not look at it. The heavy, stern face and the 4 fingers filled his vision. The fingers stood up before his eyes like pillars, enormous, blurry, seeming to vibrate, but unmistakably 4. How many fingers, Winston? 4. Stop it. How can you go on? 4. How many fingers, Winston? 5. No, Winston, that is no use. You are lying. You still think there are 4. How many fingers, please? 4. 5. Anything you like, only stop it. Stop the pain. Abruptly, he was sitting up with O'Brien's arm around his shoulders. He had perhaps lost consciousness for a few seconds. The bonds that had held his body down were loosened. He felt very cold. He was shaking uncontrollably. His teeth were chattering. The tears were rolling down his cheeks. For a moment he clung to O'Brien like a baby, curiously comforted by the heavy arm round his shoulders. He had the feeling that O'Brien was his protector, that the pain was something that came from outside, from some other source, and that it was O'Brien who would save him from it. You are a slow learner, Winston, said O'Brien gently. How could I help it? He blubbered. How could I help seeing what's in front of my eyes? 2 and 2 are 4. Sometimes, Winston. Sometimes they are 5. Sometimes they are 3. Sometimes they are all of them at once. You must try harder. It is not easy to become sane. He lays Winston down. A man checks his heart to make sure he isn't going to die right on the table. Nods to O'Brien. O'Brien says, again. The pain flowed into Winston's body. The needle must be at 70, 75. He had shut his eyes this time. He knew the fingers were still there, and still 4. All that mattered was somehow to stay alive until the spasm was over. He had ceased to notice whether he was crying out or not. The pain lessened again. He opened his eyes. How many fingers, Winston? 4. I suppose there are 4. I would see 5 if I could. I'm trying to see 5. Which do you wish? To persuade me that you see 5, or really to see them? Really to see them, again said O'Brien. Perhaps the needle was at 80, 90. Winston could only intermittently remember why the pain was happening. Behind his screwed-up eyelids, a forest of fingers seemed to be moving in a sort of dance, weaving in and out, disappearing behind one another and reappearing again. He was trying to count them. He could not remember why. He knew only that it was impossible to count them, and that this was somehow due to the mysterious identity between 5 and 4. The pain died down again. When he opened his eyes, it was to find that he was still seeing the same thing. Innumerable fingers, like moving trees, were still streaming past in either direction, crossing and recrossing. He shut his eyes again. How many fingers am I holding up, Winston? I don't know. I don't know. You will kill me if you do that again. 4, 5, 6. In all honesty, I don't know. Better, said O'Brien. A needle slid into Winston's arm. Almost in the same moment, a blissful, healing warmth spread all through his body. The pain was already half forgotten. He opened his eyes and looked up gratefully at O'Brien. At sight of the heavy, lined face, so ugly and so intelligent, his heart seemed to turn over. If he could have moved, he would have stretched out a hand and laid it on O'Brien's arm. He had never loved him so deeply as at this moment, and not merely because he had stopped the pain. The old feeling that at bottom it did not matter whether O'Brien was a friend or an enemy had come back. O'Brien was a person who could be talked to. Perhaps one did not want to be loved so much as to be understood. We've already read the sections that follow later, and I'm going to do that for my son to make a change